This morning, the scene on the way to the cross, which is always during this season of Lent where we're headed, shifts to the Gospel of John. Jesus makes a promise about his future in this text, as well as a major confrontation with the religious leaders of his day. It's an exciting narrative, and it can feel really raw when we get to the part in the temple. Just before this passage we look at today in the Gospel of John, Jesus had a wedding in Cana. That was a fun event. It was a big wedding. They'd run out of wine. Jesus turns water into wine, and the wedding was a fantastic success. He made wine out of water, one of the many miracles that Jesus performed. Then the shift happens. It takes us to Jerusalem, where Jesus went up, and always going to Jerusalem was always going up. It's actually much higher than the rest of the plains nearby. Passover was coming, a critical event to celebrate for the Jewish people. When Jesus arrived at the temple, he was confronted with a carnival atmosphere, hardly appropriate for the events to be celebrated in the temple. He found sellers of oxen and sheep and doves, as well as money changers collecting fees from the many pilgrims who had come from all over the area to be a part of this temple celebration. Essentially, this holy time was a message of blasphemy, ripping off pilgrims arriving for the ceremonies at the temple. Jesus was infuriated. I want to emphasize this point. Jesus was truly angry. I remember in Sunday school as a kid, it was a great Sunday school, everything was fine, but there was always this one painting of Jesus where he looked so serene, so sweet, so kind. That was certainly one aspect of Jesus, but it wasn't the whole picture. Nobody painted a picture of Jesus angry in my Sunday school class. But this time, he was really, really angry. Let's not sugarcoat the reality of it. He was truly angry, and the vendors were stealing from people and denigrating the point of the festival. People were there to rip people off and make money. And nobody's against making money, but to sell trinkets to religious pilgrims is not a good idea. So the day at the temple, it was a rough one for the people who were in the way of Jesus. It's kind of odd to think that Jesus was always serene. He was both human and divine. Let's give him his humanity a chance to be demonstrated. And for now, it was really demonstrated, and for a very good reason. What a scene that had to be. What an actual amazing scene. The money changers had ripped off their last customers of that day. The seller of doves was put out of business. Picture it as really a small riot, because that's what it was. It was quite a shocking scene for the followers of Jesus at the time. So much for the abuse of the temple and for its followers. Those days were going to be over. Completely over. I like to picture this scene in my mind. Imagine the disciples slack-jawed at what they were seeing. Can you imagine just their mouths hanging open? He's doing what? Jesus is doing that? He's taking it to the money changers? He's upset. He's really angry. Wow, this is a new side of Jesus we hadn't quite seen like this. The scene was at the temple, and it was a really big scene. Now here's a crucial point. The disciples at this point simply didn't understand Jesus fully. They only had a glimpse of it. They only had a glimpse of all the sweet things he'd done and the healings he had done, the meals he had multiplied, the wine he had made from water. All of these things were wonderful, wonderful things. But now they're seeing another side of the Lord. They are starting to understand the whole person of Christ, but they wouldn't fully understand the whole person of Christ until after the resurrection. You know, we're like that. We're no different from the disciples. If we're sick, we ask Him to make us well, and it's good to do that. If we're angry, depending on our personalities, we either ask Jesus to validate our anger or to forgive us for it, depending on our own personalities. We certainly are no better than the original disciples. We are utterly dependent not on our own ideas, but what Jesus did and continues to do. What are the other questions to wrestle with? Well, one of the questions we got to wrestle with as the followers of Christ in this era is what outrages us. Jesus was outraged by the misuse of the temple. He was outraged that people were being ripped off and abused, that people were giving their hard-earned money for no good purpose. What outrages us? Does anything outrageous occur to us? As followers of Jesus who turn the tables over and the money changers, does anything cause outrage in us? Are we willing to battle against evil, whatever we believe that God is designated as evil? I happen to read a lot of news online. That's not necessarily a good thing. I'm just kind of a news junkie. And some days I read the news and I'm just numb at all the struggles of the world. Some days it kind of wells up into some more of kind of anger, but how the world could be at times so messed up. But there's days where I'm outraged by wars and crime and general evil, but then there's days I just go into kind of a passive state. And I wonder if most of us Christians don't sort of have to go into a passive state to deal with all the struggles we hear about or read about or struggle with ourselves. When people are suffering, and we know people will always suffer and struggle on this side of heaven, we know that. What can we do? When we roll up our sleeves, we will be doing the work of the Lord. For what are we supposed to roll up our sleeves? John chapter 2 was a presentation of the many facts and facets of Jesus' personality and those of His Father. Early in John's account, Jesus took up the happy task of creating great wine, and most of us love that story, and then we get a little bit out of shape when He goes into a temple with a whip and starts taking on the people who are ripping people off. Really unnerves us to learn, and I'm certain this is true. The gospel writers were certain it was true. This was the day Jesus signed His death warrant. He made a lot of the wrong people mad because of His reaction to the temple misdeeds. People really loved His miracles. Who wouldn't love His miracles? But folks were not always excited about His teachings, and those sometimes hit a little too hard. Things like loving one's enemies. Things like paying a special attention to the poor or giving sacrifices over and above to the causes that count. We, or at least I do this, I don't know if you do, sometimes consider anger a sinful emotion. I know it when I see it in myself. I know it if I'm angry about something, whether it's sinful or righteous anger. It's usually sinful. But what Jesus did that day was righteous anger. So there's plenty to be mad about in the world. We could all make a list of the things that make us mad in this world. But do we get mad at the right things? I don't have anything particular in mind. It's more of a challenge to think about. It's more of a realization we have to kind of wake up to every now and then. Is there anything in this world that bothers me enough that it makes me filled with righteous anger to help make a change in those things? I imagine a few things can come to our minds, and your minds can be thinking about those things even as I speak. I imagine a few things come to our minds when we think about it. That day long ago in the temple in Jerusalem, we're seeing a different side of Jesus than the preacher likes usually to talk about. One day, to illustrate this, I learned from a person who happened to be a pastor of the necessity of having a sense of when to be angry about what and what situation. Laurie and I had moved to Chicago, which is a place we had tried to avoid for a long time. But a church recruited us to come to Chicago, and we went there and I worked on the staff of a large church, and I was responsible for all the staff. There were probably 70 people in that big church. I oversaw the staff and the pastors on that staff, and there was one interesting guy that frankly I didn't get along with real well. I'm a pretty friendly guy. I generally get along with people, but this one guy, we just seemed to have kind of a disagreement on most things in most meetings. He was a strong, and I emphasize this in a very positive way, he was a strong social justice Christian. Social justice was his thing. And his assignment on the staff was dealing with people who had been ripped off in life, struggling in life. He was kind of the pastor there to the poor, which was a very noble thing. And here I was, a conservative guy from Oklahoma, and we wound up really becoming good friends. But Mike and I were two different cats. One day, after some tensions in our relationship, we mutually decided that we needed to go to lunch and have a long lunch. He said, let's go into the city. I've got a favorite place in the city. We were in the suburbs. So we went to a restaurant in the city, and wow, it was different. We were the only two Anglos in the room, and there were a lot of folks there that day. To say that it was an interesting collection of people, and the sounds and noises and laughter and fun and anger and hostility, all of that was expressed in some way by the many in that restaurant that day. Many different languages could be heard, though, but I couldn't understand those. It was a noisy, kind of exciting environment. It was over lunch that day that Mike challenged me on a few points of theology and practice. We had a really lively exchange. I don't know that I'd want to repeat it, but it was a lively exchange. I very much respected my more social justice liberal friend, and the conversation was good, though we maintained some disagreements for sure. At one point, Mike got animated about the poor people he worked with in his ministry and how they had been ripped off by people who had money, things like costs for rent, food, heating oil, you name it. He was truly outraged, and at lunch, he expressed his outrage. By the end of the long rant, I was obviously thinking, I probably don't really fit in the urban environments of Chicago. And later, we left. Laurie fit better than me, but we eventually left. Not so much because of the city, and certainly not because of Mike. We just liked Oklahoma, where folks are a little more sedate, maybe. I learned that day a lot from Mike. One lesson I learned is that there's more than one way to be a Christian in a needy world. To be a Christian is to believe in the divinity and holiness of Jesus Christ. But there's more than one way to act that out. Well-meaning Christian people can disagree on matters and still love the same Jesus. What that day did, especially for me, was remind me of the scene described in John chapter 2. The money changers were a menace to God's justice and purposes. They were contrary to everything God preferred. The Christian life calls for the exercise of justice and righteousness in how we treat people. I'm sure I'm speaking now to people who figured that out a long time ago, but it was important for me to learn that lesson. So the season of Lent, which we're in for a few more weeks, Lent calls us out to many lessons, many things to think about, pray about, live up to. The scene in Jerusalem, the scene at the temple in Jerusalem, practically screams to us that justice, fairness, and love are crucial aspects of the Christian mission. I was moved not only by the passage this week, but also by the numerous initiatives that were announced last week for this good church to help the struggling in this community. Maybe you remember last week's announcements. There were all kinds of things that were announced that were to help people to put, some sort of traction to the gospel message in the real lives of people. This is the work of the Lord, and Lent is the perfect time to highlight it. Yesterday, I watched 28 people, and trust me, I just watched. They did all the work. I pretended I really had to be working on the sermon. You can be the judge of that. Probably would have been better if I'd worked. But I saw 28 people really rolling up their sleeves for the sake of making this church look better. And we want people who come to visit us to think we care about this church as much as Jesus would have cared about the temple. We care about it. We have a love for it. We want it to shine with its goodness. Perhaps the final lesson in all of this is that Jesus would not tolerate the taking of advantage of other people for the sake of the faith. Never, never, never. Once again, as always, Jesus, his actions were the ones to follow, and they still are. Would you pray with me? Oh God, in this holy season of Lent, when we're called to examine our own hearts, our own consciousness, our own conscience, our own willingness to roll up our sleeves and do the simple work of God, may we do that. May you open our eyes just a bit further this next few weeks of Lent to realize there are lots of people hurting, lots of people who need to love Jesus, but lots of people who need to know that Christians really do care. Because we do. May we act on it. Through Christ the living Lord we pray. Amen.